This is a review of the art and making of the Dark Knight trilogy. I'm a really big fan of these movies, but the behind-the-scenes books that have been released have been kind of disappointing. For Batman Begins, there was the kind of lackluster art book, and then there's also a visual companion and a script book, which weren't very good. And then for the Dark Knight, there was the terrible script book masquerading as an art and making of book. They did actually release a couple of more fiction-based books like the Dark Knight Manual and the Batmobile Owner's Manual. They were pretty cool, but they weren't really books about the making of the movie. And yeah, the books that were just so disappointing. But then Hallelujah chorus broke out, and this book descended onto shelves to wash away the sins of those past books, because this is a really fantastic book. And I think that they actually recognized that Batman Begins and The Dark Knight hadn't really got their due diligence, and so they released this book to cover the whole trilogy, which is just so great. Whenever they release a book that covers multiple movies, it's always kind of disappointing because you feel like they're going to have to cram 3 movies into a very limited space, which is usually true and kind of true for this, but this book is 300 pages, so it's super thick, which is great to see because there have been other books like the Lord of the Rings making of book or the Pirates of the Caribbean making book that also cover trilogies and are about half the size of this book. Even before this book was released, I kind of suspected it was going to be pretty good just because of the team who were working on it. It's published by Abrams, who are known for publishing really well produced, really well constructed books, and this is no exception. And the text is written by Jodie Duncan, who over the last 20 years has probably written about a dozen making of books, and she's also the editor of Cinefex, and her co-author Janine Paroy is also a writer for Cinefex. And even though I personally have kind of a love-hate relationship with Cinefex, I am always the first to admit that it has consistently had the best film journalism of any movie magazine. So having 2 people from that magazine working on the book was certainly promising, although the writing style does sort of fall into the trap of a lot of making of books of sounding like a magazine article. I really don't think that the journalistic sort of style and tone lends itself well to a full-length book and often becomes a very tedious read. But like I said, we've got 2 authors here who are among the best, so it's not going to be as noticeable as in a lot of other books. I think one thing we've got to address straight up before getting too far into the book is the title, The Art and Making of the Dark Knight Trilogy. This is not an art book by any real stretch of the imagination. Now, personally, for me, that was not a problem. The book doesn't lose any points for that, but I have seen a lot of other people's criticisms of the book being called The Art and Making of, when the book really should have just been called The Making of, because there is not much art in here at all. And so, like I said, even though that didn't really bother me, I can definitely sympathize with people who feel misled, because I know there are some people who don't really like making of books and just prefer art books. So if you come to this book just looking for art, you're gonna feel very cheated, which is why I love doing these flip throughs, because now we can take a look through and see what's up, and you can tell if this is something you're going to be interested in. Additionally, compared to a lot of the sort of coffee table art books I review on this channel, this isn't the most lavish or fancy book. You know, there aren't little things to pull out, there aren't fancy borders and graphic elements and gatefolds and things, but considering how many books do that and then end up being all style and no substance, and even though I like all those things, it was really refreshing to see this book show that you don't need those things to produce a great book, and that content is what really counts. And I don't mean to suggest this book is not attractive, not at all. I find it very modern, simple, clean, just very functional and effective, but still enormously aesthetically pleasing as you turn the pages. Just the layouts and symmetry and page designs, it's all done very intelligent, and it does all that without leaving a lot of white space. Almost every page takes full advantage of its space, which is great. I will say, even though the text is great, I still kind of wish there was more. If you evened everything out, you probably are only getting a quarter page of text per page, but thankfully, like I said, because this book is so thick, it's really giving the illusion, or perhaps reality, that there's still a ton of content and information to be gleaned from this book. But the text to images ratio is always sort of like a wanting to have your cake and eat it too kind of thing, because any book only has a finite number of pages, and we want a ton of images, but we also want them really big, and we also want a lot of text, and it's like you can't really service all those things when you've only got a finite number of pages and page space. In this book, it's not perfect, but for my money, it comes closer than pretty much any other to achieving a fantastic ratio of the number of images to the size of the images to the amount of text. So for an otherwise really intelligently well done book, there is one thing that is kind of just dumb, and that is the ordering of the text in the book. So I don't really like talking in absolutes or like hard and fast rules for how things should be. I love seeing different and unique approach to the ways people make and present their books. But one thing I feel very strongly about is the idea that the only way to present a making of book is chronologically, and this book doesn't really do that. The way it works is it's broken up into different sort of sections of production, like, script writing, casting, production design, costumes, blah, blah, blah. Breaks down each of those different areas. And then within those areas, it looks at Batman Begins, then The Dark Knight, then The Dark Knight Rises. Now, I understand the sort of logic in that you're able to see the evolution of the process over the trilogy. However, from a sort of editorial standpoint, it does not lend itself well to an even read, because, say for instance, you'll be reading about the casting of Anne Hathaway and Tom Hardy in 2010, 2011, whatever, and then you'll turn the page and then suddenly you're back to 2004 reading about the costuming for Batman Begins. And so every section always sort of jumps back, and it just makes it very disjointed, and was probably one of the only real problems I had with the book. But that's not really something that's going to ruin your enjoyment. I think in reading the book, my favourite part was sort of the birth of this trilogy in Christopher Nolan's garage, where it was just him and David Goyer, who was writing the script with him, and then sometimes Christopher Nolan's brother Jonathan would be there writing the script as well, and then production designer Nathan Crowley sort of working on like the models and concept art. And I just think it's sort of great that it was just these sort of four guys working in a garage, for Batman, which is one of the biggest intellectual properties of all time. This trilogy in ticket sales and merchandise, DVDs, etc., has made billions and billions of dollars, was just born from a couple of guys knocking about in the garage. And it's really kind of fun and charming to see this concept art for these huge Batman films hanging over a washing machine in a garage. And every time they started work on the sequels, they would come back to the garage to start the creative process. And the garage itself sort of grew from 2 rooms into like proper offices, and then Christopher Nolan bought the house behind his to expand it. And I just found it sort of a charming and refreshing view of modern filmmaking. So by the end of the book, I still would have liked a little bit more text, just to add a bit more depth, just to be able to slow things down a little bit, so they didn't have to race past a lot of things in just a sentence or two, but still found it immensely satisfying. And I'm just so glad that Gotham finally got the book that it deserves.